All right, thank you everyone for joining us here today. My name's Robert Fordrain, and I will be your first presenter, and my colleague Greg Pallas will take over halfway through. So what I will be presenting today is as a new tool to basically look at fresh cow monitoring and to improve transition outcomes. So the items we'll be covering are first a little bit background on transition cow management, and then we'll talk about this new fresh cow index, or you'll hear the word FCI quite a bit. And then we'll talk about, so what is the relationship between FCI and future performance, and how relevant is it to what we believe a cow will be doing to the rest of her lactation. We'll share a little bit about how the FCI data can be presented and how you can utilize it. And then Greg will take over and show you some real life examples of dairy farms that we've monitored through this. So first, a little bit about the transition period. So the term transition refers to the period, the process of a cow not producing milk, either as a heifer or a dry cow, then calving and starting to produce milk. So the transition period was traditionally the 3 weeks prior to calving and the 3 weeks following calving. However, research has shown that you really need to look further back than those 3 weeks. So now we're typically looking at the cow physiology to 60 days before calving and 30 days after, since that has an impact on how the cow will perform. So the total period is a 90-day window that makes up the transition period. So why is this important? Within the 2 days after cow calves, the energy needs of a cow more than double. So with that, there's a lot of metabolic stress that is associated with the increased energy demand, and that can be pretty dramatic impact on the animal. So how does this cow handle the stress and moves through that 90-day transition period influences her production, health, ability to become pregnant again, and an end result, will she stay in the herd? So how does a farm prevent transition cow problems? Well, we first have to reduce the amount of time the cow spends with a negative energy balance, and to do that the cow needs to eat and increase her feed intake. So we have to maximize how much the cow can eat, her feed intake, and early lactation. And we need to make sure she takes enough calories to balance the scales. So aspects that play a role in that could be the amount of room the cow has to eat, how much room there is in the pen that she's housed in, obviously the feed itself through the ration, any feed mixing, the feed delivery, the ability for her to get access to water, and many other items that impact her feed intake. So how do you evaluate or analyze transition cow problems? So what we will talk about is one way of looking at it, but there's multiple things to look at. So the thing we will be covering is her predicted performance. What do we think this cow should be able to perform and produce versus what she actually did after she calved? The other aspect is fresh cow udder health. Do cows start out with high somatic cell count, potential for mastitis? Then there's the turnover, death rates. Some cows have a very rough start and die, and you like to minimize that. And then there's the dry period analysis, the 60 days prior to calving. How is that working? Are we getting cows managed well through that dry period? So I'll talk a little bit now about the fresh cow index. So fresh cow index, or FCI, is the ratio of energy corrected milk on test day on the first test day divided by the predicted energy corrected milk. In the formula, it's basically the first test day ECM and the first test day between 5 and 40 days in milk divided by what we predicted that cow should be able to produce times 100. So why do we put it on a scale like that? 100 means the cow did what we actually thought she would do. So if we believe a cow was capable of producing 90 pounds of milk, she did 90 pounds, her FCI would be 100. She does better, it'd be a value over 100. If she does worse, it will be a value below 100, so she underperformed. So the question then you probably are asking, how did we define, what FCI, how is FCI calculated? How do you come up with that predicted energy corrected milk? So that took a lot of research. We worked together with Dr. Albert DeVries from the University of Florida, and a lot of parameters go into this calculation. So there's 25 of those. So the breed of the animal, when she calved to adjust for seasonality, the region, cows have different, where they live has impact on their performance, how many times she's milked, her calving ease. We use the genetic information that was obtained through the Council on Dairy Cattle Breeding. If the cow started her lactation with an abortion, what was her gestation length between when she was bred and actually calved, and her age at calving. In addition, for a first lactation animal, we look at the dam's performance. How did her mother perform in her first lactation? On the cow that already had a lactation, we look at her prior lactation as a source of, how do we think this cow will produce her next lactation? Lactation number, the length of the dry period, how many days milk she had in her prior lactation, and how many days open she had. So those are all parameters that go in the model to calculate that predicted energy corrected milk. And like I said, it's only calculated for animals 5 to 40 days in milk, because once you go beyond 40 days, you're not really looking at the impact on the initial calving. So what's the relevance of this? People say, okay, big deal. So you tell me a low FCI, high FCI. So we looked at about 1.5 million animals in the DRMS database and broke it out by 10 FCI increments. So we went from less than 70, so those cows were actually underperforming, to animals over 130. So they did way better than what we predicted they would do. So what did we see as a difference? One, on first lactation cows, the culling rates on those animals from less than 70 all the way up to over 130 reduced. So you can see here we went from 26.7% culling rate on those animals in their lactation down to 23.2. So less of those animals would get culled later in that lactation. Peak milk, huge difference, 69 pounds versus 94 pounds. So although we're looking at 5 to 40 days in milk, we can already tell that those animals that had a really good start will produce more at peak milk. And when you look at the completed lactation at 305 days, so you can see those animals that did really well at the start produced over almost 7,000 pounds more milk throughout the rest of that lactation. So that's on first lactation animals. When you then look at your later lactation animals, the differences are even more pronounced. So the culling rates are a little bit higher, obviously, on older cows, but there's almost a 4%, a little bit over 4% difference with the cows that had a poor start versus those that did really well. The peak milk, you're almost talking about 40-pound difference. So, and then as far as the total lactation, we're looking at 23,000 up to 32, so even bigger difference of almost 9,000 pounds of milk more throughout the rest of that lactations for those cows that started out really well. So we can tell that that FCI value has a lot of predictive value for the rest of that lactation. So what sets this measure apart from other measures that are out there? I mean, some people just look at the first test, they milk yield, on a fresh cow and say, okay, we pick the low ones, the high ones. Well, what went into the model is that the data represents all regions of the United States. It wasn't just built based on Midwest data or Northeast data. It was data that was used from all across the U.S. As I mentioned, that's a lot of data. So we used 1 million first lactation records and 2 million older lactation cows to come up with this predictive model. It works for first and older lactation cows. Most people would think, well, if all I can use it for is older lactation cows, what about my heifers? Because that's where a lot of decisions are made if that animal's going to continue in the herd or not. And what's really neat about this was that it uses genetic data, it uses obviously production data, it also uses reproduction data and calving information to come up with this prediction. So that's, as far as we know, the most inclusive set of data that we have to calculate or develop this formula to predict the cow's future energy corrected milk. And then, we know there's farms out there that are not paid on energy corrected milk, so there is a version that looks at milk only as well. So if you don't have components on your animals, we can still calculate this using the milk value only. So how do we look at it? So here's a couple examples of how this looks like for a farm. So we calculate, like I said, for each cow after calving or FCI value, and this graph shows you how we group it by month of calving. So we assume that all those animals that calved in that month went through the same management style. They're going to have the same impacts by weather, housing, etc. So you can see, the bar here represents the bottom is your 25th percentile, and the top of the bar is your 75th percentile. So when you rank all the animals, from that calved in that month, from the lowest to the highest, you have the bottom 25, the top 25, and then you have the median in the middle. So the median is the black line. So the 50th cow is where the median is. So how do you interpret this? You basically look at how the bar moves around that red line. So if everything was great, these blocks would all be above that red line, which means over 100. But, you're going to have some cows that do great. You're going to have some cows that don't do so well. But when you look at the bar, like here we have a period of time, in earlier or later 2024 where it really dropped. So what happened with those animals that calved in this month? And then it picked back up and we did well. Now we had another drop. So you can look at how these bars move, but the other thing you can look at is the width of the bar. So the smaller that bar is, that means a lot of cows are all producing very consistently at the same level. Their FCI values are very close. The wider that bar means there's a lot of variations. You got cows that did really bad, and you got cows that did really well. So what you really want is a narrow bar. So that's how you can look at it over time. So, every time we have new DHIA data, this graph will get updated. And you can see the trend and talk to your nutritionist, your veterinarian, say, okay, what happened here or what happened here? And, what did we do right? Because it went a lot better the month after. If you want to look at the individual data, so, there's other factors to consider when you start evaluating. So for each calving month, you get the counts. Then we have a lot of twinning, a lot of abortions that month. What was the calving ease? Did we have a lot of cows with difficulty in calving? We look at gestational length. We look at, short versus long, somatic cell count. Did we have a lot of cows that started out with mastitis? So what does it mean? So this number here, that minus 17.9 for the month of August, what that tells me is if the cows that were below 100 FCI had performed at what we predicted they should be able to, we would have gained almost 18 pounds of milk per day. So that's a significant amount of opportunity to improve that transition cow management program. So you can see here in this column, how much opportunity of improvement there is in any given month. We also have a way of looking at this on an annual basis. So instead of just looking at each month, at what does my program look like over the past 12 months. So there's an annual summary here, so you can look at what if my cows that had calved in the past month had been at 100 FCI or higher. So it gives you actual numbers here of what we believe you could have gained. So this line here on first lactation cows in this herd, we could have gained almost 5 pounds per day if these animals that were below had gone above 100. On our older lactation cows second, that number goes up to 8.6. and then on the third and greater, 11 pounds. When you look at it as a whole, for example, that third lactation, we could have gained 4,000 pounds of milk over a 35-day period for all those animals that performed below expectations. So those are some things you can look at as a whole for the whole herd. You know, your culling rates, you know, how many more cows did you cull because of a poor transition? Some want to just look at individual animals. So here's a graph. Each dot represents a cow at first, second, or third lactation. So you can see, you know, that 100 is again the desired line. You know, you want 100 or above, but you can see cows that perform below. And if you kind of look across, you can see here that in early 2025, we started seeing more cows drop below that 100 line. So the question then is why? That's when you start, you know, talking to the folks on the farm, the management team, the nutritionists. What did we do somewhere here between, you know, the end of 2025 and what's happening here, you know, later in 2025, like August? Why are we seeing more cows dropping? So that's a way to look at individual animals. If you are interested in seeing the values on each cow, you can certainly pull that up. You know, it gives you what we believe the cow produced, you know, her milk yield, fat, protein, that's all DHIA data. And you can basically drill down on some of these low cows and find out why. So I'm going to turn it over now to Greg, who's going to show you some real life examples of how good versus, you know, a poor herd looks like.
Thank you, Robert. Okay, so what we're going to look at today are we're going to compare two herds for Fresh Cow Index using Fresh Focus. So Fresh Focus is kind of the whole transition review using Dairy Depot. So these are two herds, very similar herds, both over 2,000 cows, rolling herd average, both over 29,000 pounds, cell count between 100 and 200,000 SCC, and they do regular monthly testing. That's one thing I want to emphasize. As Robert mentioned, this evaluating that first test between 5 and 40 days. So we do obviously encourage monthly testing in order to get that first test within that time frame. So let's look at our first herd. This herd is consistently at or above 100, so which indicates there's an excellent transition program is being implemented, minimal variation within calving groups. So everything looks really good on this particular herd. So as we look at some porting information, calving difficulty is normal, although slightly increased in the past few months, which may indicate why there's a slight drop in the FCI. So low percentage of short or long gestation lengths, so everything looks good there. Our average FCI is 100 or greater for each month. Cell count data is good with low infection rate and high cure rate. By cure rate, what we're doing, we're looking at the last tests for cell count of the cow's prior lactation and then her first test. So dry periods are also pretty normal. So this really kind of accentuates that high or value of FCI at 100 or above. Everything looks good, which complements that. So looking at some culling information, lactation 2 cows leaving the herd during the first 60 days are under 5%. Lactation 2 cows, the death rate is under 3%. For the entire herd is pretty low. So this information also complements that. So then let's look at this herd. So we're looking at lactation 2 here. On the first one is actually the third lactation. The herd is consistently below 100. Transition program is pretty much in question. And if you look at lactation 1, that's even worse. So we're trying to then kind of figure out, okay, what is unique about lactation 1? Well, I know this herd, and they are in expansion mode, and their lactation 1 cows are basically having to fight for bunk space with their older cows as well. So that's kind of why lactation 1 cows aren't performing as expected. So then let's look at the data The percent of difficult calving is higher compared to our prior herd. So higher percent of abnormal gestation lengths, a lot more longer and a lot more shorter ones than our prior herd. Cell count data is higher, infection rate above 10%, and a lower cure rate, if you look over to the far right. Dry period lengths, a lot of very short dry periods. This herd thought they would try doing 60-day dry periods on those lactation 1 cows when they dry off, and lactation 2 and greater are doing a 45-day dry periods. So when they calve in as lactation 3, this may be the reason why their FCI is so much lower. They really did not have that sufficient number of dry time. So in the end result is an FCI value below 100, indicating underperformance. So this kind of is, this graph or this chart here kind of explains why, or what some factors went into explaining why those low FCI values. All these things combined together just resulting in a low FCI value. So if we're looking at the culling information, lactation 1 cows leaving the herd during the first 60 days at sometimes are above 8% and higher percent died than our prior lactation or our prior herd. Lactation 2 cows are comparable, but as I mentioned, they are in expansion mode, so they are keeping cows around a little bit longer than what they may normally be culling. So let's look at this annual report comparison. Side by side, looking at our first herd and our second herd. So the predicted ECM in both herds are very similar. As we can tell that both these herds are very similar as far as production goes. So the herd 1 FCI score is 100. If you can see over looking there, they're all 100 or very close to it. FCI score for herd 2 is lower, definitely underperforming, and that herd lactation 1 group is way underperforming. As we saw in that graph earlier as well, lactation 1 is really struggling. So herd 2 potential gain per cow per day is twice as much as herd 1. So they're leaving a lot of milk on the table, so to speak. So if we were to actually look at this herd and using a $20 milk price, herd 2 income potential or the first 40 days of milk could be about $400 per cow. So that's how much potential they would have if their fresh cow index would be at 100 or above, if their in transition program was a little bit better. So there's some monetary value there and that they need to look at. Herd 1 has a higher percent of cows with an FCI value above 100, which we had seen earlier, and herd 2 shows a much higher percent below 100. So if we're looking at this, so for those that we're looking at 42.8% on a lactation 1 cows in herd 1, and lactation 2 cows we're barely looking at 7%. So vast difference in the fresh cow index on these two. So as we can see, we can kind of showed and can compare the fresh cow index. These graphs are part of the Dairy Depot section in our HerdHQ. So if you want to thank both Robert and I for having this opportunity to provide this information to you from DRMS. And at this time, we'll open it up for questions.
Any questions? There you go.
Really a nice tool here, Robert and Greg. And I was wondering, have you thought about having on your report screen like sort of a comparison against a contemporary group? So for example, you have the table where there's lots of numbers, right? And you have first, second, and third. Have you thought about something like where you might say, hey, compared to your herds of similar demographics, you're doing a great job on your first lactation animals. Maybe you have some opportunities in these couple of areas to improve, say for your older cows, like a way to maybe help highlight key points, because this is great information, but there's really a lot to look at, and I wonder if people might get lost a little bit.
Yeah, we do have another tool complementing that. We have what we call milk metrics, and that does allow you to compare pretty much all of our management factors, and you can decide what read you want to do, what breed you want to do, what herd size you want to compare to. So we kind of complement the two. Obviously, if you're comparing full fresh cow index, the average should all be about 100, and that's what we have found. And so we just need to determine on a particular herd where those are. So hopefully those tables can address those. But yeah, it'd be great to know, okay, my percent infection was 46%. What is the average? You know, is this really low or this really high? So.
I think to add to that, as you saw, there was a lot of presentation that's about distribution of cows. You know, I always like to use the analogy. So I got 2 feet here. I'm going to put my left feet in a bucket of ice cold frozen water. I could put my right foot in a bucket of boiling water. On average, John's going to feel pretty good, right? But neither one's going to feel pretty good. So you have to always be careful with averages. So as you saw here, we look a lot at distribution, like those bar graphs you saw on the chart. You know, the wider those things are, that means you got a lot of variability between your cows. If we did the average, it might say, hey, it looks pretty good. So, and I think the comparisons with what herds are doing, yes, we can compare averages. And like Greg said, we have another tool where you can do that, where you can look at what do I do this last month, the month before, the year ago. So you can look at your own changes, but you can also look at what did other herds do of similar size, breed, you know, region. So, you know, sometimes the weather's bad. I mean, we showed this to a herd in Pennsylvania. We had a rotten summer. It was wet, and, you know, we had problems. So you could see the bar going down. It was like, yeah, we just had, you know, weather issues, and cows had a hard time transitioning. But I caution people, don't always look at averages when you look at numbers. Look at the distribution of those numbers.
Thank you.
Thank you. Great presentation. As a reporter from Isomark. Do you hear me?
A little closer.
Have you included or looked at the effect of negative energy balance due to ketosis? And if so, could you please elaborate on that one on your scores?
Sure. So right now it does not include any type of health information. That we do have health information on some of the cows. The problem is that, you know, we have 25 variables already included. So if we say, okay, we want to include, you know, if a cow had, you know, a DA, you know, ketosis at the start, we'll probably knock down the number of animals we can calculate this for. That doesn't mean it's not a good idea. It is a good idea. It's just that, you know, the number of farms that are reporting that type of information, you know, you keep shrinking the population of farms that you can provide this to. So, but yes, it could be part of a, you know, enhancement for farms that do collect that type of data.
And one thing to add to that, though, there is one of the little charts that does have all the individual cows listed. And if you do see a cow with a low FCI, you can go ahead and bring her up and find out that, oh, it is low because she had ketosis. So ketosis may be an explanation as to why her index is low.
Here. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Greg, for a great presentation. Really love that, the tool. I have one Two questions. So you mentioned 25 variables to create the index. So all these 25 variables, do they have the same weight when the equation was created?
Yes. So all these variables are calculated through standardized protocols. So, as Greg mentioned, it's DHIA data. So, the milk meters, the lab analysis, they're all the same. So those values can all be compared across all the herds. As far as the genetic data that went into it, that's also standardized through Council on Dairy Cattle Breeding. So a PTA milk on one herd is no different than a PTA milk on another herd. So when we calculated this, obviously we wanted to use a lot of variation to look at the differences, and that's why the model is what it is. And but yes, all the data that went into it are all standardized across all herds, no matter where it was collected and by who it was collected.
Okay. So, meaning, for example, so herd health is not included, but so you have somatic cell count, right? So, and we know how that is attached with, other conditions, metritis, mastitis, subclinical mastitis, etc. So, let's say that the herd has really low somatic cell count, okay? So how that is going to weigh that? So that is going to bring me, up to close to 100 in that index.
Right.
So how knowing my producer, so I can say, they want to check the index, but they will not, let's say I have a 80 to that index. What is bring me to, within these 25 variables, to that 80 index? So
Right. So like you said, there's 25 things that could contribute to the 80. So again, part of the 80 is the difference between the ratio of what I thought this cow could do versus what she actually did. So what she actually did, I can't change. That is just what on this test day, she was supposed to, create 90 pounds of milk. She did she did 70. So the 70 is a fixed number. That there's nothing that we calculate for that. The question is the 90. How do we come up with that she should have been able to do 90? So some of these parameters weigh heavier than others.
Okay, that's my,
so each one has a weight. Now some have a negative impact while others have a positive impact. So, when you look at all the individual pieces, some will weigh a lot heavier than others. We actually have two different models, one for the first lactation cows and then the older lactation, because we don't have the same data on those first lactation cows as you would on older lactation. So, if I know that this cow produced 30,000 pounds in their prior lactation, that's really good information on the first lactation cows. The best I can give you is what her dam did and what her genetic potential is. So, but as Greg was showing, so what are those factors that might have caused this value to be low? And that's when, you look at that supporting data, like, was it a short gestation length? Was it a short dry period? So when we showed that graph with all the dots of each cow, you can click on one of those dots and say, okay, what was going on with this cow? Maybe, we thought she was going to be a tremendous, genetic cow, but she really did not do very well.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I want to point out one thing. I mentioned it briefly, but, a lot of people say, well, what's the big difference between me just looking at, I got two cows, one that at 90 pounds and one that's 70 pounds on that first test day. Who's the poor performer? Who's the poor performer? The 70-pound cow, right? So, but I can have with FCI actually that 70-pound cow performed better than that 90-pound cow, because we might have thought that 70-pound cow was only capable of producing 60 pounds, but she did better. Well, that 90-pound cow, we predicted she was supposed to do 110, and she only did 90. So it's how do we think that cow should produce versus what she actually did. And then you track, as I showed in the numbers, those cows that tend to do better than what we think they should do, they will end up doing better throughout the rest of that lactation. and less of those animals will end up getting killed. And I know in the example that Greg showed on that last slide, at the bottom you could see the culling rates on those two herds. There's a huge difference, you know, and that's, you know, when you look at the very start, those animals, you know, are they going to be problem cows, recovery cows? So, and they do tend, you know, more of those low FCI cows end up leaving. So, I have no more questions. Thank you for coming, and if you appreciate your time. Thank you. And if you have some direct questions, you can come to Greg and me. We'll be more than happy.